Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It was June 2nd, 1987, one of those early summer days when the heat settled in before noon and never quite let go. In the small town of Brookhaven, Georgia, the school year had finally come to an end, and for 18-year-old Emily Carter, life felt as though it were standing on the edge of something new. Graduation was less than 48 hours away. In a few days, she would be leaving with friends for a celebratory trip to the Florida Keys, the first real taste of freedom after years of structure and routine. That morning, Emily had followed her usual rhythm. She shared breakfast with her parents, joined them for a short family prayer at the kitchen table, and then left for choir rehearsal at the high school auditorium. She had been chosen to sing the national anthem during commencement, an honor that made her both proud and quietly nervous. By early afternoon, the sun had grown relentless. Emily spent the next few hours at a friend's house, drifting between the pool and the shaded patio, laughing, talking about dresses and plans, and trying not to think too hard about how fast everything was changing. When she finally said her goodbyes, she climbed into her silver Dodge Omni, still damp from the pool, barefoot, hair tied up hastily with a scrunchie. She turned onto County Route 14, the familiar road that led back to her family's home on the outskirts of town. The Carter house sat alone on several acres of land, bordered by open fields that stretched outward like a shallow sea of tall grass. The driveway was long, nearly a quarter mile, beginning at a narrow roadside mailbox and ending at the white two-story home set well back from the road. Emily had driven that stretch thousands of times. It was quiet, almost meditative, and she rarely gave it much thought. As she slowed near the mailbox, she noticed the small stack of envelopes waiting inside. She parked, left the engine running, and stepped out to retrieve them, absently flipping through the mail as she leaned against the car door. She never heard the other vehicle approach. The sound came suddenly, tires crunching softly against gravel as a dirt-colored sedan pulled in behind her. At first, Emily assumed it was someone turning around or perhaps a neighbor who had taken a wrong turn. She glanced over her shoulder. The driver's window was down. The man behind the wheel was unfamiliar. He looked to be in his mid-30s, his hair dark and unremarkable, his expression fixed in a way that made her uneasy without her fully understanding why. He said something to her, but the words were swallowed by the hum of both engines and the distant buzz of cicadas. Emily frowned, unsure she had heard him correctly. She took a step closer, instinctively polite, instinctively trusting. The man did not repeat himself. He opened his door and moved faster than she could process. In a matter of seconds, he was in front of her, blocking her path. She barely had time to gasp before she felt cold metal pressed against her side. It took her a heartbeat too long to recognize it for what it was, a gun. His voice was low, urgent, stripped of any pretense. He told her to get into his car. He told her not to scream. He told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as he said. Emily had been raised in a quiet home, taught to believe that most people were good, that danger was something distant, something that happened elsewhere. In that moment, shock wrapped around her like a heavy fog. She obeyed. She left her car running. The letters slipped from her fingers and scattered across the ground. The man forced her into the passenger seat, closed the door, and drove away, pulling back onto the road as though nothing unusual had occurred. Behind them, the Carter driveway stood empty, the mailbox door swinging slightly in the heat. Emily's father, Daniel Carter, noticed something was wrong not long after. He and his wife, Margaret, had been in the backyard working near the garden and enjoying the breeze that drifted lazily across the property. Daniel glanced toward the driveway and saw Emily's car parked near the road. At first, he thought nothing of it. She often checked the mail before pulling in. But as minutes passed and the car remained where it was, a quiet sense of unease began to settle in his chest. Margaret suggested that Emily had stopped to read a letter, maybe from one of her cousins or a friend from out of state. Daniel nodded, trying to accept the explanation, but the feeling would not go away. Eventually, he wiped his hands on his jeans, got into his truck, and drove down the driveway. What he found made his stomach drop. The car was still running. The driver's door was open. Emily was nowhere to be seen. Her sandals were on the floorboard. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, unzipped. Letters lay scattered across the ground like fallen leaves. Daniel noticed faint footprints leading away from the car, bare feet pressed into the dust, but there were no prints returning. His hands shook as he reached for the purse. His fear sharpened when he found Emily's medication still inside. Emily suffered from a rare endocrine condition that made her body unable to regulate fluids properly. Without regular medication and access to water, dehydration could become life-threatening, especially in the heat they were experiencing. Daniel drove back to the house faster than he ever had before. Margaret knew something was wrong the moment she saw his face. He told her what he had found, his voice breaking despite his efforts to stay calm. She grabbed her keys and left immediately, driving through nearby roads, calling Emily's name out the open window, scanning ditches and tree lines. Daniel called the sheriff's department. When Margaret returned empty-handed, the reality they had been avoiding settled fully into place. Emily was missing. Law enforcement arrived within the hour. Under different circumstances, the response might have been slower. Emily was 18, legally an adult, and in many jurisdictions at the time, authorities required a waiting period before classifying such cases as urgent. But Emily's medical condition changed everything. The risk was immediate. The search began that same afternoon. Within hours, the property was transformed into a command center. Patrol cars lined the road, deputies moved through the fields, helicopters circled overhead. The county's emergency management division brought in mobile units equipped with radios and phone lines, allowing investigators to work around the clock. Volunteers poured in from surrounding towns. Friends, church members, classmates, and strangers formed search lines, combing through woods, fields, and roadside ditches under the punishing sun. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Emily's scent from abandoned car. The dogs followed the trail briefly, then lost it near the edge of the road, suggesting she had been taken by vehicle. Witnesses began to come forward. 2 men reported driving past the Carter mailbox just after 3 in the afternoon. They recalled seeing a young woman standing beside a silver car and a dark sedan approaching from the opposite direction. One of them believed the car was a late-model Buick or Oldsmobile, possibly maroon or dark purple in color. They remembered the brakes flaring as it stopped. When they passed by again minutes later, Emily's car was still there, but she was gone. Despite the mounting effort, the first day ended without answers. A red bandana, identified as Emily's, was found less than a mile from the house along the shoulder of the road. Investigators believed it may have been dropped intentionally from a moving vehicle. It was the only physical trace they had. As night fell and temperatures finally dipped below 90, the search paused. Exhausted volunteers were asked to return at dawn. Everyone involved understood the unspoken truth. Time mattered, and somewhere in the vast quiet of southern Georgia, Emily Carter was running out of it. Morning came slowly over Brookhaven, the air already thick with heat before the sun had fully risen. By the time volunteers began arriving again at the Carter property, the humidity clung to skin and clothing as though the day itself were reluctant to let anyone move freely. Sheriff Reeves had slept barely 2 hours in a folding chair inside one of the mobile units, his radio crackling through the night with updates that led nowhere. There had been no ransom call, no taunting message, no mistake phone call from someone who had seen too much and wanted to say something without getting involved. Silence, in cases like this, was never a good sign. The second day of searching expanded far beyond the Carter land. Deputies fanned out along County Route 14, checking abandoned buildings, drainage culverts, and wooded pull-offs. Helicopters flew low over nearby farmland, their blades chopping the air as they scanned for any disturbance in the tall grass. Search dogs were redeployed at multiple points along the road, but each time the trail ended the same way, abruptly, as if Emily had vanished into thin air. The implication was impossible to ignore. Whoever had taken her had planned enough to use a vehicle, and he had done it quickly. Margaret Carter refused to leave the command area. She sat beneath a temporary canopy, clutching a bottle of water she barely touched, answering questions when asked, staring down the driveway when no one was speaking to her. Friends from church tried to sit with her, to offer comfort, but grief and fear had narrowed her world to a single unbearable thought. Emily needed her medication. Every hour without it mattered. Every hour stretched tighter than the one before. Investigators began canvassing nearby towns, checking reports of suspicious vehicles, traffic stops, anything that might fit the description witnesses had provided. A bulletin was sent out across the state for a dark maroon sedan, possibly an Oldsmobile or Buick from the early 1980s, driven by a white male in his 30s. Tips flooded in. Most were well-meaning, few were useful. A car seen at a gas station, a man acting strangely at a rest stop, a vehicle parked too long along a rural road. Each lead was checked. Each one ended the same way. By the afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. The heat claimed several volunteers, sending them to the hospital with dehydration and heat exhaustion. One deputy twisted his ankle in a ditch. Another was treated for a spider bite that swelled rapidly in the heat. Still, no one wanted to stop. No one wanted to be the one who went home while Emily was still missing. That evening, investigators found another item along the roadside several miles south of the Carter home. A thin silver necklace tangled in low brush near a sharp curve in the road. Margaret identified it immediately. Emily had worn it nearly every day since her 16th birthday. The discovery brought a brief surge of hope. It meant she had been alive long enough to lose it, or maybe to leave it behind. But it also suggested movement, distance, and intent. The necklace led nowhere else. By the third day, the case had grown too large for the county to handle alone. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was brought in, followed shortly by federal agents from the Atlanta field office. Emily's disappearance fit a troubling pattern that law enforcement across the Southeast had been quietly tracking, a series of abductions that began and ended without warning, leaving behind families and questions, but no clear suspect. The agents did not say this aloud to the Carters, but Sheriff Reeves understood the significance. This was no longer just a local crime, it was something darker. Interviews Daniel and Margaret again, this time in greater detail. They asked about Emily's routines, her friends, any recent arguments, any strangers who might have taken an interest in her. The answers were always the same. Emily was careful. Emily was kind. Emily was loved. There were no secrets waiting to be uncovered that might explain what had happened. As the investigation widened, a troubling theory began to take shape. Witnesses along nearby highways reported seeing a car matching the description traveling south at high speed on the afternoon Emily vanished. A gas station attendant nearly 30 miles away recalled a man stopping briefly for fuel, his passenger seat occupied by a young woman who stared straight ahead and did not speak. At the time, it had not seemed unusual enough to remember clearly. Now, under questioning, the memory returned in fragments. The timeline fit, the direction fit, but it was not enough to act on. Behind closed doors, agents discussed the possibility that Emily had been taken across state lines. If true, it meant the search radius had just expanded exponentially. It also meant that the clock they were racing was running faster than ever. The Carters' phone line was monitored around the clock. Each ring made Margaret flinch. Each pause between calls felt heavier than the last. Still, no ransom demand came, no instructions, no proof of life. For investigators, the absence spoke volumes. Kidnappings driven by money followed predictable patterns. This did not. The man who had taken Emily had not wanted leverage, he wanted her. On the fourth day, a farmer contacted authorities after finding tire tracks near a disused service road that cut through his property. The tracks were fresh enough to raise interest, and deputies secured the area immediately. The road led into a wooded section thick with undergrowth, rarely visited and difficult to access. Search teams moved in carefully, scanning the ground, marking anything that seemed out of place. A crushed patch of grass, a broken branch, a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Late that afternoon, they found something that stopped them cold. In a shallow clearing, partially concealed beneath fallen leaves, lay Emily's shoe. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle, just the shoe, worn and scuffed from years of use, sitting alone where it should not have been. For some, it was a sign of hope, evidence that she had been alive long enough to lose it or perhaps to remove it herself. For others, it was the opposite, a reminder that the trail was thinning, that each discovery brought them closer to an ending they did not want to imagine. Margaret collapsed when she saw it. Daniel held her as she cried, his own grief locked behind a rigid stillness that frightened those who knew him best. By the end of the week, media attention had descended on Brookhaven. News vans lined the roads. Reporters asked questions no one could answer. Emily's face appeared on television screens across the region, smiling in her senior portrait, frozen in a moment that now felt impossibly distant. Tips increased, but clarity did not. Behind the scenes, agents focused on building a profile. The abductor was likely familiar with the area. He had acted quickly, confidently, and without hesitation. He had chosen a location that offered isolation and escape. He had used a weapon not to harm, but to control. And he had disappeared without leaving a trace substantial enough to follow. Days passed, then weeks. The search officially scaled back, though no one involved ever used the word ended. The trailers were removed, volunteers returned to their lives, the fields grew quiet again, but the case remained open, active, unresolved. Emily Carter was still missing, and somewhere the man who had taken her was still out there, carrying a secret that haunted an entire town. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Brookhaven moved forward on the surface, but beneath it ran a constant undercurrent of fear and unfinished grief. Yellow ribbons faded in the sun, posters peeled from telephone poles. The Carter driveway, once crowded with patrol cars and volunteers, stood empty again, its long stretch of gravel undisturbed except for the occasional visitor who slowed out of respect rather than curiosity. Inside the house, time seemed to stall. Margaret kept Emily's room exactly as it had been the morning she disappeared. The bed was made, the suitcase for the graduation trip sat half-packed in the corner. Every night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table long after Daniel had gone to bed, staring at the phone as if her will alone could make it ring with the right kind of news. Sometimes she imagined Emily calling from a payphone, apologizing for the worry, saying everything had been a misunderstanding. Other times, the silence pressed in so tightly that she had to step outside just to breathe. Investigators never stopped working the case, even when the public attention waned. The federal agents assigned to Emily's disappearance reviewed similar crimes across neighboring states, searching for overlap. Slowly, a name began to surface, not as a suspect, but as a pattern. A man who drifted from job to job, town to town. A man with a history of minor offenses that never quite rose to the level of long-term incarceration. He owned vehicles that changed often, registered under different addresses. He had been questioned before, always briefly, always released. His name was Thomas Hale. Hale had been stopped for a traffic violation less than 50 miles south of Brookhaven on the afternoon Emily vanished. At the time, the stop seemed routine. No passengers were noted, no weapons were visible. He gave an address that checked out, at least on paper. By the time investigators connected the dots weeks later, Hale had moved again. They tracked him to a rural property outside a small town near the state line. The land was secluded, the kind of place people chose specifically because they did not want neighbors. Hale lived alone in a modest house with a detached shed behind it. On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about the property, but experience had taught the agents that the most ordinary places often concealed the worst truths. A search warrant was obtained quietly. There would be no press this time, no spectacle, just answers if they were lucky. When agents arrived, Hale was not home. Inside the house, they found little more than what one might expect: sparse furniture, old magazines, a stack of newspapers saved for reasons no one could immediately explain. The shed, however, told a different story. The air inside was stale and cold. There were signs of recent cleaning, too recent. Bleach lingered beneath the heavier smell of oil and metal. They found Emily's necklace inside a toolbox tangled with fishing line. The discovery shifted the investigation from hope to certainty. Hale was taken into custody later that evening at a roadside motel. He did not resist. He did not ask why. He simply stared ahead as if he had been expecting this moment all along. During questioning, Hale was calm to the point of detachment. He denied everything at first, then offered partial truths that twisted the narrative just enough to delay clarity. He claimed he had picked Emily up because she needed help. He said she came willingly. He said she had been alive when he left her. Each statement unraveled under scrutiny, contradicted by evidence, by timelines, by the cold facts that did not care about his version of events. It took 3 days before Hale finally spoke the words investigators had been dreading. Emily Carter was dead. He led them to a lake miles from where he had been arrested, its surface smooth and deceptively peaceful. Divers worked carefully, methodically. When they brought her up, the crowd of officials fell silent. There was no relief, only a heavy, shared grief that pressed down on everyone present. Emily had been gone nearly 2 months. The news reached the Carters in the early morning hours. Sheriff Reeves delivered it himself. Margaret did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply closed her eyes and nodded, as if some part of her had already known. Daniel held her hand, his grip tight enough to hurt, as if letting go would mean losing her all over again. The funeral drew people from across the state. The church overflowed, the air thick with heat and sorrow. Emily's friends sat together, clutching tissues and memories they were too young to carry. Margaret spoke briefly, her voice steady despite everything. She thanked the community for not giving up, for believing Emily mattered. She asked them to remember her daughter not for what had been done to her, but for who she had been. Hale's trial began the following year. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Hale showed no visible reaction. He never looked at the Carters. In the years that followed, Brookhaven changed in subtle ways. Parents watched their children more closely, mailboxes were moved closer to houses, conversations lingered a little longer at dusk. Emily's case became a reference point, a quiet warning passed down through generations who had never known her but felt the weight of her absence all the same. Margaret and Daniel established a foundation in Emily's name focused on education and awareness. They spoke at schools, at community centers, wherever people would listen. It was not healing, exactly, but it was purpose. It was something to hold on to in a world that had taken too much. Sometimes, late in the evening, Margaret still sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. But now, when she stepped outside for air, she looked up at the sky instead of down the driveway. She thought of Emily not as she was in her final moments, but as she was that morning in May, full of plans, standing on the edge of a future she never got to live. And though justice had been served in the legal sense, the true cost of what happened could never be measured in courtrooms or sentences. It lived on, in quiet houses, in empty bedrooms, and in the unspoken understanding that some losses never fully fade. Emily Carter was gone, but she was not forgotten. Daniel Rowan was born on April 12, 1948, in the quiet town of Maplewood Heights, a comfortable suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. He was the first child of Dr. Leonard Rowan, a respected anesthesiologist, and his wife, Claire, a former piano teacher who had chosen to stay home after marriage. To neighbors and friends, the Rowans were the picture of post-war success. They lived on a tree-lined street, attended church on Sundays, and hosted polite dinner parties where nothing louder than laughter ever crossed the walls. Within the next decade, Daniel would be joined by 3 siblings. First came a sister, Elaine, then 2 younger brothers, Mark and Thomas. The house was busy, sometimes cramped, but never chaotic. Money was not an issue. Leonard's career flourished during the economic boom of the 1950s, and before Daniel reached middle school, the family relocated to a larger home with a wide yard and a finished basement. For most children, it would have been an ideal place to grow up. Daniel's early years offered little hint of what he would become. Teachers described him as polite, if somewhat distant. He was intelligent, but not exceptional, quiet, but not withdrawn. He followed rules, rarely acted out, and seemed eager to please adults, especially his mother. Claire adored her eldest child and often described him as sensitive, a word she used proudly, never suspecting how much complexity it concealed. His father, Leonard, was often absent, not through neglect, but through long hours at the hospital. When he was home, he was reserved and structured, a man who believed discipline and order were the foundations of success. Daniel learned early how to behave in ways that earned approval. He kept his room tidy, he spoke when spoken to, he learned how to disappear into the background. Socially, Daniel occupied a middle space. He was not bullied, but neither was he popular. He had a small group of boys he spent time with, mostly out of convenience rather than deep friendship. They rode bikes, traded baseball cards, and told jokes that grew darker as they aged. Daniel, in particular, developed a taste for humor that made others uncomfortable, though they often laughed anyway, unsure whether they were supposed to. By the time Daniel entered adolescence, something subtle began to change. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sudden outbursts, no alarming behavior that would have sent their parents rushing for professional help. Instead, there was a slow shift inward. Daniel became more private. He spent more time alone, wandering the edges of neighborhoods, lingering in places other children passed without notice. He developed a fascination with things others avoided: old cemeteries, abandoned sheds, the aftermath of accidents on the road. He did not speak about these interests, but they occupied his thoughts with increasing intensity. To Daniel, these things represented mystery, permanence, and control. They were silent. They could not reject him. At school, his grades remained steady, but teachers noticed his writing assignments growing increasingly bleak. Stories ended abruptly, characters vanished without explanation, violence appeared suddenly without emotion or consequence. When questioned, Daniel shrugged and said he was just being creative. At home, his family noticed little. Claire assumed adolescence was responsible for his moodiness. Leonard was too busy to notice at all. His siblings, younger and wrapped up in their own worlds, rarely crossed the invisible boundary Daniel built around himself. One afternoon during his early teens, Daniel was walking home from school when he stopped along a quiet roadside. Traffic passed occasionally, but the area was otherwise empty. He stood there longer than necessary, staring at something near the ditch. When another boy from school approached and asked what he was doing, Daniel jumped slightly, as if startled out of a private trance. The moment passed. The boy laughed it off. They walked on together. No one thought twice about it. But for Daniel, moments like these lingered. He began collecting objects that held meaning only to him. Feathers, broken pieces of glass, rusted metal fragments. He hid them in a box beneath his bed, not because he feared discovery, but because he liked knowing they were his alone. Each item represented a feeling he couldn't name, a sense of power over something abandoned or forgotten. As puberty set in, Daniel's internal world grew more intense and more isolated. Thoughts came to him that felt intrusive, unwanted, yet strangely compelling. He learned quickly that sharing them would lead to confusion or rejection, so he kept them locked away. Outwardly, he remained calm. Inwardly, he felt increasingly detached from others. What troubled him most was how easy it was to pretend. He could smile at dinner, joke with classmates, and sit through church services without anyone suspecting the growing divide between who he appeared to be and who he felt himself becoming. That realization, more than anything else, gave him confidence. He was learning how to wear a mask. There were moments when Daniel wondered if something was wrong with him, but those thoughts never lasted long. Instead, he convinced himself that everyone had secrets. His were simply darker, more interesting, more honest. By the time Daniel reached high school, Daniel Rowan had mastered the art of being unremarkable. He blended in effortlessly. Teachers trusted him, neighbors waved, his parents felt quietly proud, and all the while the thoughts he nurtured continued to deepen, shaping the person he would one day become. No one noticed the warning signs because they were not loud. They did not scream for attention. They whispered, they waited, and Daniel listened. High school brought new challenges for Daniel Rowan. Outwardly, he remained the same polite, quiet young man his family and teachers had always known. He attended classes diligently, maintained decent grades, and even joined the chess club and track team, activities that allowed him to move through the world unnoticed while keeping his mind sharp and his hands occupied. But behind the carefully maintained calm, Daniel's thoughts had grown more intense, more consuming. He began to experiment with small acts that allowed him to test boundaries, to see how far he could push without being caught. These were minor at first, a broken window here, a startled neighbor there, but the thrill came not from the damage itself, but from the secrecy, the sense of control. He found himself drawn to places where others avoided, areas abandoned, neglected, or quiet. There was an old mill on the edge of Maplewood Heights, closed for years and guarded only by a sagging chain-link fence. Daniel spent hours wandering its hallways, examining the graffiti, the rusted machinery, and the way the sunlight fell through cracks in the ceiling. It was a private world in which he could exist on his own terms. What fascinated him most, however, were the traces of life left behind, the small, overlooked details that told stories. A child's toy left near the playground behind the mill, a tattered coat snagged on a fence post, the skeleton of a bird tucked into the corner of the floorboards. Each object spoke to him, sparked a feeling he couldn't name, a curiosity that went deeper than mere interest. Daniel's friends noticed the change, though they did not understand it. They called him weird at times, laughed at his quiet, peculiar jokes, and eventually learned to accept his company without needing to pry. To Daniel, this was ideal. He did not need approval. He did not need distraction. He had his own obsessions to occupy him. At home, Daniel's parents noticed the growing silence, but attributed it to adolescence. His father was increasingly busy at the hospital, and his mother, though attentive, was preoccupied with her younger children. Occasionally, Claire Rowan would try to engage him in conversation, asking about his day or offering guidance, but Daniel's responses were polite and vague. There were no outbursts, no rebellion, only a polite deflection. School counselors observed his behavior as well. They noted his intelligence, his calm demeanor, and his academic consistency. But there were moments, rare and subtle, when his fixation on certain subjects worried them. Essays about death or loneliness, stories that lingered on decay or the passage of time, puzzled the teachers. They assumed it was adolescent angst, a phase he would outgrow. It was during this time that Daniel developed his first habit of collecting what he called evidence of life. Unlike other boys his age who collected stamps, coins, or baseball cards, Daniel preferred things that carried a story of neglect or decay. A fallen bird, a crushed insect, a broken tool all became objects to study, catalog, and understand. He kept them in a wooden box beneath his bed, meticulously organized. To him, they were not merely curiosities, they were lessons, glimpses into a reality that others ignored. As he moved into late adolescence, Daniel's inner life grew more intense. He began writing extensively, not for school, but for himself. Journals filled with observations, questions, and ideas that he did not share with anyone. They contained analyses of human behavior, theories about control and vulnerability, and reflections on the things he had seen and collected. Each entry was more detailed, more deliberate. They were exercises in understanding, but also in imagining outcomes he had not yet experienced. Friends came and went. Daniel maintained relationships, but they were shallow by design. He learned that emotional attachment could be distracting, could limit freedom. He observed his peers with interest, noting their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. He would later describe this period as a time of quiet study, though in hindsight it was also the beginning of a moral and emotional detachment that would define much of his adult life. At home, Daniel's parents' relationship with Leonard remained cordial but increasingly distant. Leonard, proud of his eldest son's academic performance, rarely questioned him, assuming that his success and politeness were signs of stability. Claire, meanwhile, tried to encourage Daniel's creative pursuits, offering books, art supplies, and trips to the library. She suspected nothing more than an unusual imagination. One summer, around age 16, Daniel encountered an event that would have a lasting impact. Walking home from a friend's house, he came across a neighbor's dog that had been struck by a car. The animal was still alive, but suffering. Most children would have screamed, called for help, or run. Daniel, however, froze. He crouched nearby, observing the animal's movements, the shallow breathing, the subtle sounds it made. He watched until it succumbed to its injuries. The experience was not one of joy, but of fascination. He was drawn to the edge of life and death, to the vulnerability of creatures in a world that continued without pause. He understood, in a way he could not articulate, that life was fragile, that it could be studied, and that its end could provoke profound reactions. The memory stayed with him, imprinted in a manner that textbooks or conversations could not replicate. High school also introduced Daniel to the concept of secrecy in social groups. He learned that knowledge could be power, especially when combined with careful observation. He noticed which classmates feared confrontation, which teachers were strict, which neighbors watched too closely. He experimented with small tests, moving an object and watching for its owner to notice, creating minor disturbances and observing reactions. Each successful test increased his confidence in his ability to manipulate and predict outcomes without detection. By the time he graduated, Daniel Rowan had become highly skilled at masking his thoughts and intentions. He had friends and acquaintances, but no one truly knew him. He had a family who loved him, unaware of the intensity of his private fascinations. He had journals, collections, and private experiments that allowed him to explore his curiosity safely, at least on the surface. But beneath this composed exterior, a darker curiosity continued to develop. He began to imagine scenarios, sometimes inspired by news stories or books, where he could observe and control human behavior in ways that went beyond social manipulation. Unlike earlier experiments with animals and objects, these scenarios involved people, though never physically yet. He did not act, he only imagined, but the intensity of the imagination began to blur lines. Daniel's high school friends noticed the growing seriousness in his demeanor. He was still quiet, polite, and observant, but his humor had become dry, often laced with an ironic cruelty that made others uneasy. Some classmates avoided him, some laughed to mask discomfort, and some were simply unaware. This period marked the refinement of his social mask, a boy who could appear ordinary while thinking extraordinary thoughts. After graduation, Daniel attended a local college studying psychology, a subject that allowed him to observe, analyze, and manipulate without arousing suspicion. Professors praised his insight, his careful analysis, and his attention to detail. Classmates admired his intellect. Yet Daniel used these studies not just for academics, they were opportunities to explore human behavior, testing theories, and constructing mental models of control, vulnerability, and compliance. At home, the Rowan family began to notice the emotional distance in a more tangible way. He spoke less at the dinner table, withdrew more frequently, and spent increasing hours in his room or the library. The younger siblings, growing into adolescence themselves, looked up to him without fully understanding him, seeing only the calm and intelligent elder brother. His parents remained largely unaware, assuming that college life and adolescent independence naturally explained the change. During these years, Daniel also began working part-time at local businesses, maintaining the facade of normalcy while continuing his private studies. He learned the rhythm of everyday life, the routines of townspeople, the patterns of neighbors, the subtle vulnerabilities in social structures. Every observation reinforced a sense of understanding, a feeling that he could predict behavior, even manipulate it if necessary. By the time Daniel turned 21, his outer life appeared conventional. He had graduated college with honors, held a steady job, and maintained casual friendships. Yet the inner life he had been cultivating since adolescence had intensified. His interests had become more abstract, more psychological, and occasionally more obsessive. The boy who had collected feathers and roadkill had become a man who collected knowledge of human behavior, testing and refining theories of influence and control. It was during this period that those closest to Daniel would later reflect on small, disturbing signs they had missed. the way he lingered on others' misfortunes in conversation, the way he seemed indifferent to pain or suffering unless it allowed him insight, and the way he occasionally smiled at moments others did not understand. None of these outwardly indicated violence, yet they hinted at the careful cultivation of detachment and observation, traits that would later make him capable of things no one in Maplewood Heights could have imagined. Daniel Rowan had become a master of appearances. He was polite, intelligent, socially competent, but beneath the mask, the curiosity, the fascination, and the obsession continued to grow unchecked. He had learned that the world offered secrets, that life offered patterns, and that people offered opportunities to observe and study. He had learned that he could hide entirely while still watching, waiting, and imagining. And though the world around him remained unaware, the seed of what would eventually define his adult life had firmly rooted. It was a quiet darkness, subtle and slow, but present. A shadow in the mind, growing steadily, shaping thoughts, shaping desires, shaping the man Daniel would one day become. After college, Daniel Rowan moved into a small apartment near the center of Maplewood Heights. The place was modest, far from the suburban comfort of his parents' home, but it offered him freedom and privacy, two things he had come to value above almost everything else. He continued working in behavioral analysis at a local consulting firm, a job that allowed him to observe, study, and record patterns in human behavior, all under the guise of professionalism. To the outside world, Daniel was polite, competent, and unremarkable. But in his apartment, Daniel's life followed a different rhythm. The collections he had maintained since adolescence, carefully cataloged observations, photographs, notes, continued to grow. Now they included the interactions of people he watched on the streets, in shops, and in public spaces. He had notebooks filled with minute details, how long someone waited at a bus stop, the exact sequence of gestures in a conversation, the way an individual reacted to stress. To anyone else, it would have seemed obsessive. To Daniel, it was research, preparation, mastery of the subtle patterns that governed human behavior. It was around this time that his fascination began to evolve. Where before it had been objects, animals, and the abstract patterns of life, he now started to imagine scenarios involving people in controlled, high-stakes situations. The thought process was entirely hypothetical at first. What if someone reacted this way? How would it look if I could manipulate events to test a theory? These mental exercises were intense, detailed, and private. He spent hours planning, writing, and refining them in his journals. The difference was subtle but crucial. He no longer just observed, he mentally orchestrated. Daniel's social life remained superficial. He had a handful of coworkers he interacted with politely, attended the occasional gathering, and even dated casually. These interactions served a dual purpose, maintaining appearances and gathering data. He would study body language, test reactions to statements, and observe levels of trust and hesitation. Every social encounter became an experiment, every friendship a case study. He had mastered the art of blending in, and no one suspected the intensity of his private world. By the age of 25, Daniel had grown confident in his ability to navigate both worlds. The meticulous, calculated man he had become was almost entirely indistinguishable from ordinary society. Yet the fantasies he had nurtured for years were evolving into impulses. He started to feel a growing need to move from observation to action, though he did not yet act on these impulses directly. He experimented with small interventions, hiding a wallet to see how someone reacted, subtly rearranging objects to provoke confusion, sending anonymous notes that challenged people to question reality. The reactions were minor, yet intoxicating. During this period, Daniel also began a long-term study of historical crimes. He read extensively about notorious criminal cases, focusing on the psychology behind each act. He analyzed patterns, motivations, and mistakes, all while meticulously noting what he would have done differently. He was fascinated by the interplay of secrecy, control, and human error. Each story became a template in his mind, a lesson in potential action, though he justified it as academic research. At the same time, his family began noticing small changes. He visited infrequently, often avoiding meals or family gatherings under the pretense of work. When he did visit, he remained polite but distant, often excusing himself to his room to read or write. His parents were proud of his independence, but occasionally expressed concern about his isolation. Daniel smiled, reassured them, and left, returning to the private world he had cultivated over decades. It was not until his late 20s that Daniel began crossing the threshold from private experimentation to active intervention in the lives of others. The first incident was subtle, a minor deception involving a neighbor's property. He moved an object that caused a brief scare, watched the response, and recorded it. The thrill was more intense than any he had felt before. He realized that the power of action exceeded the power of imagination. Each subsequent act became more daring, more calculated. Daniel's methodology was meticulous. He observed, analyzed, and planned every step. He identified vulnerabilities, predicted reactions, and designed environments that minimized risk while maximizing control. Unlike impulsive actors, he calculated every move. He also ensured plausible deniability, taking pains to remain unseen and untraceable. This combination of patience, intelligence, and precision allowed him to escalate without immediate consequences. Over time, his impulses grew more complex. They involved extended periods of observation, detailed schematics of environments, and contingency plans for unexpected variables. Daniel began to explore psychological manipulation on a deeper level, isolating targets, creating minor crises to provoke reactions, and testing boundaries. Each success reinforced his confidence and validated his methods. He was no longer just observing, he was orchestrating. His social life became almost irrelevant. Casual relationships and friendships existed only as tools or social cover. He avoided deep connections, fearing interference and loss of control. He maintained appearances as a functional member of society while spending most of his time in the precise, controlled world he had created for himself. Yet even with all his planning, he remained cautious, understanding that any misstep could expose him. Despite the growing intensity of his inner world, Daniel remained outwardly calm and competent. Colleagues admired his intelligence, friends appreciated his dry humor, and family members assumed his eccentricities were simply quirks. His ability to mask his true self was nearly flawless, and this continued secrecy became a source of power. The duality of his existence, a polite, successful man by day, a meticulous, calculating observer by night, was a hallmark of his adult life. By the age of 30, Daniel's experiments had become fully integrated into his daily life. He had identified specific targets, people whose routines, vulnerabilities, and reactions fascinated him, and he spent months analyzing, predicting, and rehearsing responses. His actions, while still covert, had begun to involve the manipulation of circumstances that led to tangible effects on others' behavior. He did not yet harm anyone physically, but he controlled, influenced, and observed with an intensity that far exceeded casual curiosity. Friends and colleagues remained unaware, and even his family only saw a competent, intelligent man. They were unaware that behind closed doors, Daniel meticulously documented every reaction, every subtle change in behavior, and every unintended consequence. His journals had become comprehensive records, combining psychological analysis, case studies, and observations from his controlled experiments. They were, in essence, a blueprint for understanding human behavior through manipulation and control. As the years passed, Daniel's confidence in his abilities grew. He had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight while orchestrating events in his private world. Every misstep of others, every lapse in attention became an opportunity for him to refine his methods. He learned patience, discipline, and the subtlety of influence. The thrill no longer came from discovery or observation alone. It came from seeing the world respond to his quiet orchestration. By mid-adulthood, Daniel Rowan had become a master of his dual existence. He was outwardly ordinary, quietly successful, and socially accepted, yet he privately wielded an extraordinary level of control over situations he could manipulate. His moral compass, already detached in adolescence, had solidified into an internal code, one that prioritized observation, control, and the fulfillment of his curiosities above all else. It was this combination of intelligence, patience, and hidden obsession that defined the man he had become. Daniel Rowan's life, outwardly conventional, hid a complex, calculating mind. His fascination with life and death, control and observation, curiosity and consequence had evolved from the small, strange impulses of childhood into a comprehensive, calculated way of existing. Through no one in Maplewood Heights could have imagined it, Daniel's journey from an unusual, morbidly curious boy to a quietly calculating adult had been complete. He had become both observer and orchestrator, a man who understood the fragility of life, the predictability of human behavior, and the power of careful manipulation. And yet, the shadow that had grown quietly alongside him for decades remained, a latent force shaping every thought, every decision, every interaction. Daniel Rowan had not merely survived adulthood, he had mastered it in a way that few could perceive, and fewer still would ever understand. In the privacy of his apartment, surrounded by his journals, collections, and carefully documented observations, Daniel continued to cultivate his secret world. The duality of his existence, a polite, successful man by day, a meticulous, calculating observer by night, remained intact, and for him it was the ultimate triumph, to move through life unobserved, yet to know and understand far more than anyone around him could imagine.